Okay, hello, it is I, the Cybersmith. Firstly, I know what you're thinking. My, has he lost weight? Yes, he has. I used to barely be able to breathe in this thing. This shirt is just downright loose on me. Got so much space around the collar. Still something of a double chin, but all things considered, I am a lot healthier than I was definitely this time last year, and even earlier this year. In any case, yes, today I will be creating a rebuttal video to the fake news King Emperor Penguin and his video on The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies. I may eventually get around to addressing his Last Jedi fake news video, but for now we'll be focusing on this one. So first things first, ground rules. I'll be addressing what he considers to be military analysis. If he critiques the tone, acting, camera work, lighting, prop design, anything of that nature, I won't be addressing it. That's not to say I agree with him on those specific points, just that it's outside the remit of this analysis. The main things I want to focus on are the military analysis he gives, and in some instances I disagree with him on the military analysis. More broadly, however, I would say I disagree with his conflation of realism and sound military strategy. Essentially, his premise is that he feels any bad strategy or bad tactics ruin his suspension of disbelief, to which I would then have to ask, did you stop researching the Crimean War when you heard about the charge of the Light Brigade? Do bad tactics make real-life events invalid to you? I'll get into more specific critiques later on, but broadly the things I want people to keep in mind is A, the fog of war. That is to say, just because we, the audience, know something does not mean that every character in the story knows that specific thing, which in a war scenario is very, very common. And B, characters are not totally rational robots. They are not acting in 100% logical ways. They can and will do things that lack perhaps strategic value but are in line with their character traits, and which it would be unrealistic for them not to act in such a manner. So with those things in mind, I'll be analysing his video and offering rebuttal. Specific things to note, because of the whole YouTube controversy, let's try to be neutral. The YouTube controversy with copyright disputes and these upcoming EU laws. Come on, Theresa May, take us out before it's too late. Take us out of the EU. But before those kick in, I'm not actually going to directly show video clips from his video. A, because I might get struck from New Line Cinema, and B, because he might try to use that as an excuse to take this video down. I'm not saying he would, it's just I don't want to run that possibility. Where possible, I'll address the timestamps in his video that I'm addressing at specific points. If all goes according to plan, I'll be editing this together with the Shotcut video editing system, and I'm using, what's this called, just the default camera app, I think, that comes with Windows 10. So that's the software I'm using. And I'll be editing the various selections together as we go through the evening. As a result of that, there may be minor continuity errors because I'm not filming this as one continuous take. So, first things first, well, I'll address that in that video. Okay, timestamp currently in the video to which I'm offering a rebuttal is 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The original creator of that video started out by laying the ground rules, what he is going to critique and what he isn't, and stating that he's using the extended edition, all perfectly reasonable, stating that he's not going to address what's obviously fantastical and wouldn't work in reality, such as heroic characters achieving victory despite what seem to be irrational odds, all perfectly fine. So he's laid out the ground rules, as have I. This is the first piece of substantive critique that he's offered, and to which I will offer a rebuttal, and that is, sorry, better. Yeah, I'm wearing a jacket now. As I said, continuity errors. It'll happen. I'll be wearing a different hat in the next video or something. Don't know. Haven't decided yet. And that is the fact that there are both men and women in Bard's group. Now I will address why I don't think this is a valid criticism. The first thing he points out is the fact that there are physical differences between men and women. On average, absolutely yes there are, and there have been numerous studies stating that something like 1% of women who attend military groups like the infantry or the Royal Marines, 1% don't drop out. So there are obviously huge physical differences between men and women which do come into play in combat scenarios, not disputing that. Two things to consider. First, we are talking about J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium. And I can't help but think King Emperor Penguin may have somewhat missed the point. After all, if the lesson we are to take away is that people who are physically lacking in various realms, various attributes, shouldn't participate in military campaigns, well, shouldn't the hobbits have been excluded by that logic? They are, in many respects, far weaker than the average man, far weaker even than the average woman. Should they have been excluded from the War of the Ring? If they had been, well, it would have been a fairly short campaign and a fairly crushing victory for Sauron, wouldn't it? I think Obi may have somewhat disregarded the messages of the Lord of the Rings. What is it? Small hands will guide the future, for the eyes of the great are directed elsewhere. I forget the specific quote, but this is distinctly a theme of the story, or at least an applicable theme of the story, recalling what Tolkien said on the subject of applicability versus allegory. The second thing I would note is that the survivors of Laketown, he does also mention the elves, but I really only see one example of a prominent female elf in the Mirkwood forces, and I don't think you can extrapolate from that that they're a completely gender-integrated society. That's one example. One example does not a society make. So yes, Bard's force is integrated, gender-integrated. Why? Because they're in a survival situation. They have no possibility of retreat, and this was addressed earlier in the film. Once Laketown itself was burned down, Bard acknowledged the fact that, as the films had stated at multiple points, the winter had arrived. Now, these aren't trained soldiers or trained survivalists. These are, in many cases, injured, wounded fishermen and people who work in industries adjacent to fishing, who have had their homes burned down. They are using either antique weapons scavenged from Dale or adapted weapons which they've just improvised from everyday utility items. These are not trained soldiers, these are not trained survivalists. They are in an absolutely desperate situation. They can't run and hide because the closest thing there is to shelter is the ruins of Dale. They would die of hypothermia, exposure, or simple starvation. Retreat is not an option. So this is a very different scenario to Helm's Deep, whereas they addressed tell the women and children to make for the mountain path and barricade the entrance. They can't do that. Retreat is not an option. This is something King Emperor Penguin mentions at multiple other points in the video. Oh, avenues of retreat. For the humans, there is no avenue of retreat, because if the orcs don't kill them, the environment will. They have to find shelter, they have to find some way to rebuild their lives, which is the entire reason that they're there. They need gold from Erebor to rebuild their lives, and they believe they have a legitimate claim to it. That's the entire purpose for them being where they are. The reason that they are a gender-integrated force at that point is that they need every fighter they have. They don't have the option of choosing among themselves who's going to be the most suitable, because if they don't win, they'll die. The orcs aren't going to take prisoners, and before Thranduil arrived to give them aid, they were on the brink of starvation. even if some of them could survive in the wilderness, they can't evacuate the wounded, so their options really are stand and fight, in which case every single one of them has to fight, who is able to fight, or die. So this idea that they're a gender-integrated society. Laketown isn't a gender-integrated society in general. We saw the Laketown Guard in the previous film was entirely male, as far as I could tell. They are gender-integrated in this very specific situation because it wouldn't make sense not to be. Okay. Okay, current timestamp is 6:46 in his video, in King Emperor Penguin's video, and I need to get a haircut. No amount of combing is going to make this sensible. And his critique is about the initial conflict between the dwarves and the elves. Interesting to note, this was actually invented for the film. In the original books, they didn't engage before Azog's army arrived, but in the film, Azog's army doesn't arrive until a little while after their initial engagement, so we do actually see them fighting. Now, the first critique that the original video makes is that the elves cease using their arrows, and quick term, it's not firing. Firing is literally from firearms. Deploying an arrow in this term would be loosing an arrow, so they stop loosing their arrows too quickly after the first rounds of ballistae bolts are deployed. Now, ballista bolts are deployed from ballistae. Now, at this point, the original video acknowledges that this is within the realms of mechanical capability, so no issue is taken with the existence of the so-called bow catchers. There is simply a question as to how many of them can they have and how many of them can be deployed. Well, the simple answer is that Thranduil doesn't know, and this is something that's going to be a recurring theme, the fog of war. Thranduil does not know how many ballistae the dwarves have. Therefore, he cannot reliably say that the next volley of arrows won't be caught. He just knows that if he doesn't fire a volley, the dwarves probably won't risk deploying their ballistae and then having no capacity to respond to his arrow bolts. It's sort of mutually assured destruction. Neither side will resort to their ranged weapons because that gives the other side an opening to use theirs. If he knew for certain how many the dwarves had, he might risk it. He doesn't know how many they've brought and how many they've set up, because remember, neither Thranduil nor Bard were expecting dwarven reinforcements. They didn't know Thorin had sent for aid. They were expecting to find just Thorin's company and Bilbo inside the mountain. So they have no idea what size of force the dwarves have brought, so they don't know what to respond to. He's playing it conservatively, which is quite reasonable for that situation. And the second issue he brings up is that the goats would have broken their bones upon the cavalry charge, and the terms he uses a horse or a horse-like animal. This is quite misleading. Horses are notoriously fragile. They are far more fragile than similar mammals of the same size. Their bones break very easily, particularly in the legs, and they don't heal properly. That's why, famously, if a horse breaks its leg, typically the most merciful thing to do is to euthanize it, because it will never heal properly. Horses are unique in this regard because their physiology has been sculpted by evolution for speed, and almost nothing but speed. Sheep, rams, goats, those kinds of animals are not as fast, but they are a lot sturdier. A ram is so called because it will, well, ram you. Goats are a lot more robust. They can slam into solid objects and not only not injure themselves, but definitely not crack bones. You cannot equate horses with similar animals. Of course, animals like goats, rams, sheep will be a lot slower, but they are a lot more sure-footed and a lot more robust. So I think that is worthy of note. The other thing he mentions is that many of the dwarves should have lances. I think some of them do, but not all of them, and this is a valid point. They may not have known exactly what kind of enemy to suspect, but if you're going to have cavalry, you should have at least some lances. So I will sustain the point that there should have been more lances. Okay, we are now at 8:21 in OP's video. Fairly quick point, but started mostly by saying that the rest of the conflict between the dwarves and elves was quite logical. Then brings up the issue of Azog arriving with the worm armies, with the armies whose path has been opened by the wereworms. Asks a quite legitimate question of how the orcs are able to deploy so quickly after the worms leave. My guess would be that the worms retreated for a small bit, burrowed a separate path, and the orcs simply followed up the path that they had made and went straight instead of diverging along the secondary path. It still cuts it fairly quick, but I think that's a somewhat plausible explanation. We really don't know how long the wereworms are. Now, the main critique that King Emperor Penguin makes here is that Azog should have simply had his wereworms attack the armies directly. My point is, he couldn't have done that. Remember, we are talking about J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium. There is no radio, there are no satellite communications. Apart from very rare objects called the Palantiri, which were created by a long-dead craftsman in the First Age, and most of which are lost, instantaneous communication over long distances is a technology that most people don't have access to. So Azog couldn't control where the worms arrived, specifically because he didn't know where the army was going to be to the exact point ahead of time. He just knew when he would arrive because he was travelling on walkback with mounted infantry. He'd just have to work out how long will it take us to reach the Lonely Mountain. Okay, it will take us X number of days, so order the wereworms to arrive in X number of days. They choose the point they choose because it's reasonably high ground, halfway up the mountain, but he had absolutely no way of knowing exactly where the enemy forces would be, and once he's in position on Ravenhill to see where the enemy forces are, he has no way to communicate with the wereworms because they're underground. So he cannot coordinate the exact point of emergence of the wereworms. That's why he doesn't use them. He has no way of dictating it. Once they've emerged, then the jig's up. He's not secret anymore. The dwarves, elves and men obviously know that something is amiss, that the orcs are real, and Gandalf had previously addressed it, but nobody believed him because there was no proof. Well, now there is proof. Everyone believes that there is an orc army. So he issues the order, "Come forth my armies," and they emerge from the holes. So again, fog of war important. Azog cannot directly communicate orders to the wereworms when they're underground, so he can't coordinate their exact point of emergence. Moving on. Okay, so we're now at exactly 12 minutes in the original video, and the argument he makes is against the dwarven phalanx. Now, there is quite a bit of logic to this part of the original video that King Emperor Penguin made. It says that their phalanx is not broad enough to avoid being flanked, and that the orcs could conceivably move around them. Now he points out that the camera hasn't given us a bird's eye view here, but I then again want to point out the orcs don't have a bird's eye view either, except via Azog, who has possibly not finished setting up his semaphore towers yet. So we are now in a situation where, yes, they conceivably could flank the dwarves, but it's possible they don't know that. Certainly not well, and certainly the orcs in the centre of the line don't know that. Maybe some of the orcs on the edge can see that the dwarf's phalanx isn't large enough, but they would then need to turn the entire situation around, and there's a certain amount of momentum. So absolutely that's something the orcs could have taken advantage of, and perhaps should have, but I think that's something we can attribute to not wanting to change their original plan and charge around it. Certainly more competent, more well-trained soldiers would have done it. These are just typical orcs. Absolutely it is a strategic flaw, but it's one I would argue we can forgive from not the most tactically minded creatures in the world. This is why they need Azog directing them. As for why the dwarves didn't fall back to the mountain, I think you have to look at where they actually were relative to the orcs and relative to the mountain. The first thing to note is that as the orcs are running up, the more momentum they gain, the more of a danger they will be. Arresting them faster is better than waiting for them to fully build up. And they are, from what I can tell in terms of placement, they are equally, if not further away from the gates of Erebor than they are to the orcish charge. Because we have to remember where the orcs are coming down from. The orcs are coming down from the mountains, and the dwarves are from a similar path to that relative to Erebor. So, quite simply, I don't think they had time to retreat back to the statues before the orcs would have reached them, and they chose to meet them head on. Possibly a bad decision, possibly too aggressive a decision, but then again, this is Dane Ironfoot who's leading them. We know he's an aggressive person, we know he's a very stubborn person. He would have chosen the more aggressive route. We know he would have chosen to lead his forces against the orcs. Not the most strategically sound decision. Maybe they should have retreated to the statues, where their phalanx would have been more use. But again, characters are not emotionless robots. Characters will act in a way that is accordant with their nature, and it is in Dane Ironfoot's nature to be aggressive and not to give ground. Falling back to the statues would have meant giving ground. As to why the elves then decide to leap over the dwarves, this is why you don't have armies who have no coordination or central leadership, everyone going off and doing their own thing. It leads to exactly this. Why is Thranduil doing this? Because he doesn't want to be upstaged by dwarves. Is it a stupid decision? Absolutely. Is it also an in-character decision? Yes, absolutely. This isn't bad writing, this is characters acting in accordance with their nature. Dane does not want to give ground, so he moves his troops towards the enemy. Thranduil does not want to be upstaged by dwarves, so he has his forces leapfrog over them to attack the enemy. Irrational? Yes, but also in accordance with what we know about these characters. Okay, we are now at 21:30 in the original video, and this is perhaps the single biggest critique I have of King Emperor Penguin's video. It is the reason I decided to make this rebuttal. The entire argument that he makes is centered around this splitting of the forces. He does point out a few other things. This is the key thing, and certainly it's the most militarily relevant thing. He mentions a few that he doesn't like some of the action, but again, that's not what I'm answering in this critique. He mentions that it is unwise of Azog to try to open up a second front because the elves are already nowhere near the city. This is the point. He is trying to split their forces and lure the elves towards the city. He moved his troops into the city knowing that certainly Bard's humans and probably Thranduil's elves would follow them there. How does he know this? He knows this because when he initially arrived, from his point up on Ravenhill arrived, he saw the humans and elves standing together, initially fighting the dwarves. He has reason to believe that an alliance exists between the humans and the elves. Oh, and to address the earlier point that it would be difficult for the platoon to see Azog up there and he should actually be on the ground giving orders directly, no. How far do you think his voice can carry if he's on the ground, and especially if he's commanding one group in the plains and one group in the city? Having a single high point is more than reasonable because you only need one or two people in each platoon with eyesight sharp enough to see it, so it's more than plausible that you could have that working, especially as it's silhouetted against the bright sky. You've got these dark semaphore flags. That is how armies historically did communicate over long distances, so I think it's a perfectly valid way to send orders, and it also justifies Thorin's decision later in the film to attack Azog because, as I said, he's going to cut the head off the snake. He knows this is an effective way to debilitate the army of orcs because you're killing the person who's helping them to coordinate. So he sends his army into the city, believing that it will draw troops away from the melee in the centre of the field. He is proven to be correct. So this is what he meant by opening a second front. If he attacks the city, Bard will move into the city to protect the people who are currently there. He is banking on the fact that Thranduil will come to save him. As it turns out, he's correct. So this is a valid strategic position, and the reason that they don't attack the human troops rushing to reinforce them is that would defeat the point. He doesn't want to drive the humans back into the melee, he wants the humans to go into the city. Why? Because the melee is a limited area. You can only pit so many of his own troops against them, and it wastes his numerical advantage. If you can split this small force over a wider area, more of your numerically superior force can attack them. That's a good thing for you, tactically speaking. So when he's opening up a second front, the city itself is the second front. It's Gandalf who makes a mistake by assuming that he's trying to cut them off. He's not trying to cut them off. That's just an assumption Gandalf makes from his limited viewpoint. Azog is trying to open up a second front to split up the enemy forces. Now, the second critique he makes is for Thranduil's decision to enter the city. I agree this is not a strategically wise decision, but it is in character for Thranduil. We've seen Thranduil portrayed in these films as an aloof and somewhat morally ambiguous character, but he is ultimately a compassionate person. We know he brings aid to Bard and Bard's people when they were starving. We know he does comfort the captain of the guard, Tariel, after she lost someone who she cared about. We know that Thranduil is not as amoral as he initially appears to be. It's not entirely out of character for him to make the decision to go and aid Bard. It's unwise strategically, yes, but it is consistent with the way he has behaved in the film that he would try to save Bard from dying in the city. And Azog is assuming that that would be the case. Not entirely unreasonable, and it works. So the city was the objective, and stopping Bard's troops from entering the city would have been completely counterproductive. He wants to lure them in so that he can then lure Thranduil in. So this is the biggest single argument that King Emperor Penguin makes, and I consider it to be invalid. Dividing the enemy forces is a logical strategy, and Thranduil's decision, whilst irrational, is within the scope of his character as it's been portrayed in the films. This is a reasonable decision, and it does not threaten my suspension of disbelief. It's not tactically sound from Thranduil's perspective, it's very tactically sound from Azog's perspective, but it is consistent with the characters we've been given. Again, in real life, people act according to their natures. They don't always act in accordance with sound military strategy, and this is something that the person who made the video, the fake news video, appears to have forgotten. Right, so we are now at 25 minutes and 25 seconds into the original video. This is where military analysis essentially stops, and he gives a closing argument, if you will. Now, the only 2 points of military substance, there are a few other points he brings up, but the 2 points of military substance are the fact that the dwarves, that is to say Thorin and his company, emerging seems to turn the tide of battle briefly in favour of the dwarves. The second point is the fact that Thorin and company march out without armour. Now, to the second point, this is to some extent a valid argument. And yes, I know a little bit about armour. The armour that they're portrayed as wearing inside the mountain before they disrobe and move out is far more protective, absolutely. There are really just two reasons for this. The first reason is that portrayed in the making of for these films, the behind-the-scenes documentaries. The dwarven actors are already wearing heavy prosthetics to make them appear to be dwarves, and the added weight of the armour, in addition to the fact that they had to retake after retake and seen every scene from multiple angles, and a bunch of deleted stuff that wasn't included in the final cut, meant it was just too exhausting for them. They had to perform in lighter armour, otherwise they just would have collapsed. So that's the out-of-universe reason, that's the real-world reason. In-universe, I think there is one slight justification. They approach Ravenhill being carried up by these goats, and it's clearly quite a substantial distance. The only real argument I can say in favour of it is maybe the goats would have just been too exhausted to have taken them up there in full armour. So when you're travelling that much of a distance, there is something of an argument to be made for wearing lighter armour so that by the time you arrive you won't be completely fatigued. Nonetheless, I think it would have been better for them to wear full armour, but that would have made it somewhat hard to do the final fight scene between Thorin and Azog, because there'd be no justification for him getting stabbed, and it also would have been too challenging for the actors. But this is largely a justifiable critique. There is some reason why they might have done so in universe, but on the whole I do think strategically it would have been a more sound decision for them to have worn heavier armour. The other critique is that he makes is that the dwarves coming out appears to turn the tide of battle. This is a staple of fantasy, it is a staple of Tolkien's legendarium, that when the morale of a force is strengthened by the emergence of a heroic leader, a true and rightful leader, it will give them a substantial advantage. Leaders, particularly kings, are often spoken of in Tolkien's legendarium as though they glow with an inner light, and people around them find themselves enervated and reinvigorated. I wouldn't go so far as to call it magic, because as far as other fantasy properties go, or at least relative to those properties, Tolkien uses magic quite sparingly, but it is a consistent theme of the fantasy universe we are in, that being led by a rightful and just leader will increase the performance of an army. I don't think this is out of the scope of what would occur in Tolkien's legendarium, and there is some basis to it in real life. Morale is important in an infantry situation, though I do agree if we were going totally realistic and this was set 100% in our real mundane world, it would not have had that much of an effect. Rallying to their king at that point probably wouldn't have allowed them to temporarily drive the orcs and trolls back. One other critique that I forget exactly where he mentioned it was that they used the trolls unwisely to simply breach the walls to the city of Dale. The defence I would give to that is that there wasn't much room for the trolls to manoeuvre inside. When we see Minas Tirith in Return of the King, the streets are all quite widely set. There is actual room for the trolls to move around in. By contrast, Dale has far narrower streets, narrow openings, narrow doors. I simply think they couldn't have moved the trolls around in there, so that does give some justification for the trolls not entering. Anyway, that's the last segment of the video. I'm going to have a closing argument now. My closing argument, quite simply, is that we need to distinguish what we, the audience, know from what the characters in the story know. Characters in the story have to deal with imperfect information. They also have to deal with imperfect lines of communication. So just because we, the audience, are shown everything the director wants us to see doesn't mean that characters within the story will be aware of that. So yes, something might be in hindsight, oh, that was a bad idea. However, based on the information characters had at that given time, it may have been the most sensible decision to make. Second point of critique is this recurring theme, and I think I'm probably going to have to bring it up again if I counter his fake news Last Jedi video. Characters are people, or rather, characters are written to be people. People do not always act in a completely rational fashion. People make unwise decisions, and they have to live with the consequences of those decisions,